Chapter 1. The Lonely Letter. Jesse sat at his worn oak desk, the pale light from the setting sun stretching through the small window of his cabin. The wind outside was relentless, kicking up dust from the prairie and sending the faint scent of sagebrush into the air. He leaned back in his chair, the creaking of the old wood mingling with the low hum of cicadas in the distance. His rough hand was poised above the letter, but he couldn't bring himself to read it. Not yet. The handwriting on the envelope was delicate, a stark contrast to the rough world outside. His fingers lingered on the paper, feeling the weight of the words inside before he finally tore it open. His heart thudded once, a quiet echo in the otherwise still room. He unfolded the letter and began to read. Dear Jesse, I hope this letter finds you well, though I understand the loneliness that can come with living in such a desolate place. I, too, know the ache of an empty home and a silent heart. My name is Lila, and I have made the choice to come to you, to start a new life far from the world I've known. I can only hope that I will find the peace I seek, and that we might share a future together, one of understanding and trust. I look forward to meeting you soon. Jesse's eyes lingered on the last line. I look forward to meeting you soon. The words seemed to echo in the silence of the cabin. A distant coyote howled in the fading light, the sound chilling yet strangely comforting. For the first time in years, the ache in his chest loosened, if only a little. He let out a slow breath and reached for the bottle of whiskey on the shelf, pouring himself a glass. The letter was a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in his otherwise bleak existence. But what kind of life was he offering her? His ranch was as barren as the land surrounding it, and his days were filled with solitude and the endless, thankless work of a man who had no one to share it with. He had never known what it was like to have a partner, a woman who might fill the empty spaces in his life. He folded the letter carefully, as if it were something fragile, and set it down on the table. The quiet weight of it lingered in the air, pulling at his thoughts. What had driven this woman, this Lila, to choose him, to come all this way for a man she had never met? Was it desperation or hope, or something else entirely? As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and deep reds, Jesse stood and walked to the window. The vast prairie stretched before him, a sea of gold and brown under the fading light. A feeling of unease settled in his gut. He had lived in this wild, unforgiving land his entire life. But something about the prospect of this woman arriving unsettled him. What if she didn't like it here? What if she hated the dust, the heat, the isolation? He shook his head, tried to push the thoughts away. The door creaked open behind him, and the sound of boots on the wooden floor made him turn. But it was only the wind pushing his way inside. For a moment, he let the silence fill the room, allowing himself the briefest glimpse of a future that could be more than just work, loneliness, and the harsh grind of the land. Maybe, just maybe, this letter was a chance to finally feel something different, something real. He poured another drink and turned his gaze back to the open plains. The sun had set completely, and the stars were beginning to appear, scattered across the dark canvas like diamonds. There was no turning back now. He had a choice to make, and when she arrived, he thought he'd be ready. Chapter 2. The Journey West. The stagecoach rattled along the dusty trail, the wooden wheels creaking with each bump in the rugged landscape. Inside, Lila sat stiffly, her gloved hands clenched tightly on the edge of her seat. The coach's interior smelled of worn leather and stale air, but it was nothing compared to the stench of her past. The long, lonely journey from the bustling city to this desolate place in the Wild West was both a literal and emotional escape. Her eyes glanced out the window, taking in the vast, barren landscape that stretched for miles without end. The dry earth was cracked and thirsty, and the distant hills were painted in shades of brown and orange by the relentless sun. A thin layer of dust clung to her clothes and skin, leaving a film that seemed to make everything seem a little more distant, a little more muted. She had left behind everything she knew: family, friends, a life that was no longer hers. But what was ahead seemed as uncertain as the land beneath her feet. She swallowed hard, her throat dry as the earth, and pushed the thought aside. "Still a long way to go, miss." The driver called from his seat up front, his voice gruff. "You might want to rest. It'll be a few more hours before we reach the next stop." Lila nodded, but she couldn't bring herself to close her eyes. Every bump in the road, every jolt of the coach, reminded her that this was no ordinary journey. She wasn't just traveling west. She was heading toward a man she'd never met, a cowboy who lived alone on a ranch far from the noise and comforts of civilization. Her heart fluttered nervously at the thought, and she instinctively reached up to touch the letter she had written to him, still tucked in the pocket of her coat. The man, Jesse, had seemed kind in his brief letter to her. His words had been simple and direct, though there was an underlying warmth in his tone that she hadn't expected. He was a man of few words, no doubt a product of his solitary life on the edge of the frontier. She had been drawn to him, not just because of his words, but because of the life he promised, a life free from the judgment of others, a life where she could begin again. But was it really what she wanted? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, the distant sound of galloping hooves. Her heart skipped a beat. The stagecoach driver's face hardened, and his hand instinctively went to the gun belt at his side. The man, Jesse, had seemed kind in his brief letter to her. His words had been simple and direct, though there was an underlying warmth in his tone that she hadn't expected. He was a man of few words, no doubt a product of his solitary life on the edge of the frontier. She had been drawn to him, not just because of his words, but because of the life he promised, a life free from the judgment of others, a life where she could begin again. But was it really what she wanted? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, the distant sound of galloping hooves. Her heart skipped a beat. The stagecoach driver's face hardened, and his hand instinctively went to the gun belt at his side. "Hold tight," he muttered, more to himself than to Lila. She turned her head, her breath caught in her throat. From behind them, a group of riders appeared, kicking up dust as they approached at a dangerous speed. The coach slowed, and Lila's chest tightened. She had heard of such things, robbers who preyed on travelers in these parts, but she hadn't expected it to happen to her. The driver shouted over his shoulder, "Get down! Don't move!" But it was too late. The riders had already closed in. Lila's pulse raced as she instinctively crouched low in her seat, her heart hammering in her chest. The men, wearing wide-brimmed hats and dust-covered coats, circled the coach like wolves. One of them dismounted and approached the door, his boots thudding heavily against the ground. He was tall, with a scar running down his cheek and a look in his eyes that sent a chill through her. "You're a long way from home, little lady," he drawled, his voice low and menacing. Lila's throat went dry. She had no idea what they wanted, but she was certain it wasn't good. Her gaze flicked nervously to the driver, but he was frozen, his eyes narrowed in silent resignation. The man reached out, grabbing the door handle with one hand, his other resting casually on the revolver at his hip. Just then, a sharp voice rang out from the distance, cutting through the tension. "Leave her be, Jake." Lila's head snapped to the left. A figure on horseback emerged from a haze of dust, tall and commanding, his posture rigid with authority. He was dressed in faded jeans and a weathered shirt, his dark hair tousled by the wind. Jesse. She recognized him instantly, even though she had only seen a brief sketch of him in his letter. The way he carried himself, the confident yet cautious manner in which he approached a group of men, was unmistakable. "Jesse," she whispered, her breath catching in her throat. The man called Jake sneered, clearly unimpressed by Jesse's presence. "This is none of your business. Cowboy, you best turn around and head back to whatever hole you crawled out of." "I don't think so," Jesse replied, his voice steady and cold. He dismounted from his horse with a practiced ease, eyes never leaving the bandits. "You've got two choices. You leave this woman alone, or I'll make you." The tension in the air thickened, the sound of the wind, the only noise between the two men. Jake's hand hovered near his pistol, but before he could make a move, Jesse's hand was already on his own gun. The quickness of the draw was enough to make Jake hesitate. "Not worth the trouble, huh?" Jesse's voice had the sharp edge of a man who'd seen his fair share of gunfights. He took a step forward, his spurs jangling as the men surrounding the coach slowly backed off. Jake grunted, clearly frustrated but unwilling to risk further violence. With a final glare at Jesse, he nodded to his men, and they mounted their horses. The group rode off into the distance, their figures gradually swallowed by the dust. Jesse turned toward the coach, his gaze softening as he approached Lila's window. His heart pounded in his chest, not from the fight, but from the woman inside. She was a stranger, but the way she looked at him, with a mix of awe and gratitude, made him feel something he hadn't felt in years. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle, as though he'd been worried about her the entire time. Lila nodded, her breath shaky as she finally allowed herself to relax. Yes, thank you." Jesse tipped his hat, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. "It's nothing, but you best be careful out here. These roads are dangerous for folks like you." "I'll remember that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As the stagecoach slowly began to move again, Lila's heart thudded against her chest. The man she had been waiting for was now standing before her, and though they had only exchanged a few words, a spark had been lit between them, one neither of them could easily ignore. The journey west had just taken a turn she hadn't expected. Chapter 3. A Promise in the Dark. The first night at the ranch was colder than Lila had imagined. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of earth and pine. The sky above was a velvet black canvas, dotted with 1,000 stars, their light flickering like the faintest of promises. Lila stood on the porch of the cabin, wrapping her arms around herself for warmth. The creaking of the wood beneath her boots was the only sound, aside from the occasional distant call of a coyote. She had arrived just as the sun dipped behind the horizon, leaving the land bathed in a golden hue before nightfall took over. Jesse had shown her the small cabin that would be hers, a modest building with a hearth in the center and wooden floors that had been worn smooth by time. He had made a small fire in the stove, the flames crackling and dancing, but she had barely touched her food, unable to shake the nervous tension that had settled deep in her bones. Her new life had begun, but she didn't know what to make of it. Jesse was quiet, his actions kind but measured, as though he too was unsure how to navigate this new chapter. He had offered her a warm meal, a place by the fire, but the silence between them had hung thick, unspoken, as they both tried to settle into the awkwardness of their first night together. Now, Lila stood alone outside, trying to breathe in the cool night air. Her heart was racing. What was she doing here? She asked herself again, the question echoing in her mind like the coyote's mournful howls in the distance. She had left behind the familiarity of her old life, hoping to escape the ghosts of her past. But what had she expected to find here? Could she really start fresh with a man who lived a life so different from her own? A soft rustling sound broke her from her thoughts. She turned, and there he was, Jesse, standing just inside the doorway, his broad silhouette outlined by the flickering firelight. His cowboy hat was tipped low, shadowing his face, but she could see his eyes, intense and searching, like a man who had seen too much to believe in easy answers. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said, his voice low but carrying a sense of sincerity. "But if you're not too tired, I thought you might want some company." Lila hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'm not tired," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "I just needed some air." Jesse stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. He leaned against the wooden railing, his boots shifting in the dust as he let the silence settle between them. The wind had picked up, carrying the cool night with it, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Finally, Jesse broke the silence. "It's different here. I know that." Lila glanced at him, surprised by his honesty. He wasn't trying to soften the truth. He was simply speaking it as it was. She found herself appreciating his directness. He wasn't pretending that everything would be easy. "It is," she admitted, looking out at the vast, empty land before them. "It's beautiful, but I can't help but feel small, alone, out of place." Jesse shifted his weight, his gaze following hers. The flicker of the firelight caught the edge of his jaw, making the lines of his face more defined, the scars of his past evident even in the low light. He exhaled slowly, as if the weight of his words was heavy on his chest. "I understand that. It's a lot of land for one man to handle. But out here, you learn to find peace in the quiet, in the stillness." Lila turned to look at him then, really look at him. His eyes were steady, unreadable, but there was something in them that seemed to soften, something that hinted at vulnerability buried beneath the rugged exterior. "You've been alone here for a long time, haven't you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "No one to talk to, no one to share your life with." Chapter 4. Gunfight at Sundown. The following days blurred together in a whirlwind of dust, work, and silence. Lila learned the rhythm of ranch life quickly. The early mornings spent feeding the horses and tending to the garden, the long afternoons under the oppressive sun, and the nights spent around a small fire, listening to the distant sounds of the wild. Jesse was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He showed her how to use the saddle, how to care for the cattle, and how to survive in a world where the land could be as unforgiving as it was beautiful. But despite the work and the quiet companionship they shared, there was always an undercurrent of tension between them, unspoken, yet palpable. Lila couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking on the horizon, something she couldn't yet understand. It was late one afternoon, as the sun began to dip low over the distant hills, that her unease became reality. Jesse had just finished repairing a broken fence, his back glistening with sweat beneath his worn shirt. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, taking a moment to survey the land before turning toward the cabin. Lila was sitting on the porch, the soft creaking of the rocking chair barely audible above the wind. She smiled at him, but there was a wariness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Jesse sensed it immediately. He knew that something was wrong, even before the sound of hooves reached his ears. "Jesse." Lila's voice was quiet, tinged with worry. "There's something wrong. I can feel it." He turned toward her, his jaw tightening. The horses were still grazing in the field, the cattle calm and unaware, but his instincts told him something was coming, something bad. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he moved toward the house with quick, measured steps. Then came the sound. It started as a distant rumble, like thunder gathering on the horizon, but soon it took shape. A cloud of dust rose in the distance, swirling and thickening as it grew closer. A group of riders was coming, and Jesse could see them clearly now. 5 men, their figures dark against the golden light of the setting sun. Lila stood, her hand instinctively reaching for the shawl around her shoulders as she stood beside Jesse. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Trouble," Jesse said grimly, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the riders. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, was unmistakable. Cole Bennett, an old rival from Jesse's past. The man had a reputation for causing trouble wherever he went, and Jesse knew that it was only a matter of time before their paths crossed again. "What does he want?" Lila whispered, her fear palpable. Jesse didn't answer immediately. He turned to the cabin, his voice firm. "Stay inside. Lock the door." Lila opened her mouth to protest, but Jesse's eyes were sharp, his expression hard. He didn't have time for explanations. He had to face this head-on. "I'll be all right," he said, his voice low, but there was a quiet determination in his words. "Stay inside. Keep the door locked." Lila watched him for a moment, fear tightening in her chest, but she nodded, retreating into the cabin. The door creaked shut behind her, and she leaned against it, her heart pounding in her chest. Outside, Jesse was already walking toward the front of the house, his boots heavy against the earth. He didn't bother reaching for his gun yet. He wasn't worried about that. He knew what he was up against. What he didn't know was how far Cole would go this time. As the riders neared, Jesse's hand settled on the gun at his side, his fingers brushing the cold metal. He wasn't a man who liked violence, but he had learned long ago that out here, it was often the only language men understood. Cole's group pulled to a stop just a few yards away from Jesse, their horses snorting in the dusty air. Jesse stood tall, his stance unyielding, his gaze fixed on Cole. Well, if it isn't Jesse McAllister," Cole said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I heard you were still hiding out here in the middle of nowhere. I figured it was time I came by and reminded you that nothing stays buried forever." Jesse didn't flinch. "I've got nothing for you, Cole. You do best to turn around and head back the way you came." Chapter 5, A Love That Heals. The days that followed the gunfight felt like they passed in slow motion, the sun hanging heavy in the sky, casting long shadows over the land. Jesse had done what he could to make sure things were quiet again, but the tension that lingered in the air hadn't fully dissipated. The land seemed to hum with unspoken promises, both of danger and of something more, something that Jesse hadn't dared acknowledge until now. Lila had watched it all unfold. The gunfight, the standoff, and though she was relieved it was over, she couldn't help but feel a deep knot in her stomach. It wasn't just the violence that had shaken her, it was what it meant. Jesse was a man who had fought for his life, for his land, for his solitude, and she, an outsider, had been swept into it all, part of a world she didn't fully understand. But something had changed between them after that night. The unspoken tension had settled into something softer, something deeper. They were no longer two strangers trying to find their place in a world that didn't quite make sense. There was an unspoken understanding now, a mutual respect that grew with each passing day. One morning, the smell of coffee drifted from the cabin. The wind had picked up again, but it was warm, carrying with it the scent of fresh earth and the promise of rain. Lila stood by the stove, her hands gently stirring the pot, when Jesse came into the kitchen. His boots thudded softly on the wooden floor, the creak of the door announcing his arrival. He had been up since before dawn, as always, working with the horses. "Morning," Lila said, her voice still a little rough from sleep. She didn't turn around, but she could feel his presence behind her, solid and steady, like a mountain that refused to move. "Morning," he replied, his voice low yet warm, like the sun creeping over the horizon. "Smells good in here." Lila smiled, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly as she poured the coffee into 2 mugs, the dark liquid swirling in the cups like liquid comfort. She handed one to him, her fingers brushing his as he took it. Neither of them pulled away. "I was thinking," she said, turning to face him, "maybe we could take a ride into town. It's been a while since I've seen anyone other than you and the horses." Jesse raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I thought you might be getting a little cabin fever." She chuckled softly, the sound like music to his ears. It had been weeks since she'd arrived, and though the silence of the ranch was calming in its own way, she hadn't expected it to feel so empty. She wanted to see the world beyond the ranch, to understand the lives of the people who lived in this harsh, beautiful land. "You're right," she said. "I'd like to see what it's like in town. See how people live." The word hung in the air for a moment, and Lila's heart skipped a beat. His wife. She hadn't expected it, hadn't realized how it felt to hear those words. It wasn't an official declaration. There was no ring, no ceremony, but the way he said it, the way he looked at her, made it feel real. She couldn't stop the smile that tugged at her lips. Charlie raised an eyebrow but didn't comment, simply handing them their beers. Well, it's good to have you both here. This is a place of friends. Jesse took his beer and stood up, offering Lila a hand as she took a seat next to him. She accepted, feeling the warmth of his touch seep through her skin, all the way down to her heart. The conversation was light. Small talk at first, talk of the weather, the latest cattle drive, and the strange happenings in town. But as the evening wore on, something changed. The more Jesse opened up, the more Lila saw the cracks in his tough exterior, the way his eyes softened when he spoke of his childhood, of the years he'd spent alone, of the family he had lost. For the first time, Lila saw a man who had been broken, but who had learned to stand tall again. She realized that what had drawn her to him wasn't just his strength. It was his scars, his vulnerabilities, the parts of him that he kept hidden from the world. As the sun set and the shadows grew long, Jesse reached for her hand under the table, his fingers brushing hers gently. "I'm glad you're here, Lila," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I didn't know how much I needed you until you arrived." Her heart fluttered in her chest, and she squeezed his hand, her gaze meeting his. "I'm glad, too," she whispered. "I've been aching for something, someone for so long. And now, I think I found it." The saloon's lights flickered in the growing dusk, and the world outside seemed to slow. For the first time, Lila felt truly at peace, standing next to Jesse, the man who had become her home. They didn't need words to understand the depth of what they had found in each other. It was enough to know that, together, they could heal the wounds of the past and build something stronger. Underneath the laughter, the chatter, and the clinking of glasses, a promise lingered between them, a promise of love, of survival, and of a future that was theirs to claim. The road ahead would be hard, but for the first time in years, Lila knew they were no longer alone. And that was enough. Chapter 6. The Reckoning. The sun rose over the plains with fiery intensity, casting long shadows across the ranch. The day had come, a day Jesse had known would arrive, but had desperately tried to avoid. He had built a life out here, far from the noise of the world, far from the dangers of men like Cole Bennett. But now, with Lila at his side, with her gentle presence grounding him, Jesse knew that everything had changed. Lila had woken early that morning, as she always did, the cool morning air filling her lungs as she stepped outside. The sky above was streaked with shades of purple and pink, the horizon glowing like a fire that had yet to burn out. She had already begun preparing breakfast when Jesse came out, his face grim, his eyes darkened with the weight of something she couldn't yet place. "Jesse?" she called softly, her heart skipping a beat as she saw the set of his jaw, the tightness in his shoulders. "What's wrong?" He looked at her then, and for a moment his gaze softened, but the concern was still there. "It's Cole," he said, his voice low and heavy. "He's back, and this time he's not alone." Lila's stomach twisted. She had been afraid of this moment, the inevitable reckoning that Jesse had warned her about. She had seen the tension in his eyes when he'd spoken of Cole, a man who had haunted him for years. But now, as she stood in the early morning light, with the ranch stretching out before her, she understood that their peaceful life was about to be tested in ways they hadn't prepared for. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, though she refused to let the fear show in her face. Jesse's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the horizon, where he could see the faintest dust cloud rising in the distance. His hands tightened into fists at his sides, and Lila could feel the weight of the decisions he was about to make. "We prepare," he said simply, his voice steady. "We don't have a choice anymore." The day passed in a blur of movement. Jesse worked with a quiet intensity, gathering supplies, checking the perimeter of the ranch, and ensuring the horses were ready. Lila, for her part, helped without hesitation, though she could feel the anxiety rising in her chest with every passing minute. She had lived through loss before, but this felt different. Jesse had been her anchor in this strange new world, and now, the very thing that brought them together, this land, this life, was being threatened by the very man from Jesse's past that he feared most. By the time the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting the land in a golden haze, Jesse was ready. He'd sent Lila inside the cabin, insisting that she stay there out of sight, but she couldn't just sit idly by. This was her life now, too, and no matter how much Jesse tried to shield her, she wasn't going to let fear keep her from him. As dusk fell, Lila stepped out of the cabin and made her way to the barn, where Jesse was already waiting, his silhouette framed by the flickering lantern light. "You can't protect me forever, Jesse," she said quietly, her voice steady but tinged with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "This is our fight now." Jesse turned to her, his expression unreadable for a moment, before he nodded once, the corner of his mouth twitching upward in a half-smile. "I know, but I still want to try." Lila reached out, her fingers brushing his arm, and for a moment, the tension in the air seemed to ease. "You're not alone," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We're in this together." Jesse's gaze softened, his hand reaching out to grasp hers. "I won't let anything happen to you, Lila. Not while I'm still breathing." But even as he spoke, the unmistakable sound of hooves broke through the stillness of the night. A shadow on the horizon, and with it came the inevitable storm. They didn't have long. Within minutes, the riders had reached the outskirts of the ranch, their horses kicking up dust as they pulled to a stop. Jesse and Lila stood at the barn door, watching them approach. Cole Bennett, as tall and menacing as Jesse remembered, dismounted first, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. His eyes locked onto Jesse's with a kind of burning hatred that only years of grudges could fuel. "You've got a nice place here, Jesse," Cole said, his voice cold and mocking as he took in the ranch. "But it's too quiet, too peaceful. People like you don't belong here." Jesse stood firm, his hand resting on the gun belt at his side, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He wasn't going to let Cole take this from him. Not now, not ever. "What do you want, Cole?" Jesse's voice was flat, though underneath it, there was an edge that was hard to miss. Cole's lips curled into a cruel smile. "I think you know what I want. You owe me. You've always owed me." Jesse's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. The past, the old debt, he had buried it for a reason, but Cole wasn't going to let him forget. Cole's eyes flicked over to Lila, and a slow grin spread across his face. "Ah, so this is the reason for all the fuss. A woman. Didn't take you for the type, Jesse. You always seemed too lonely for that." Jesse's grip on his gun tightened, his fingers twitching, but he stayed calm. He couldn't let the anger take over. Not now. "I told you once," Jesse said, stepping forward. "I'm done with you. Whatever happened between us is over." But Cole wasn't listening. The moment Jesse took a step closer, Cole reached for his own gun, the smooth motion like a snake striking. A shot rang out, but Jesse was faster, his bullet finding its mark in Cole's arm before the man could fire again. The air crackled with tension, the wind picking up, as Cole staggered back, a growl of pain escaping his lips. "This isn't over, Jesse," he spat, clutching his wound. "You can't run from your past forever." Jesse didn't respond. He didn't need to. The fight was over, at least for now, as Cole and his men retreated into the night, disappearing into shadows. Lila stepped up beside Jesse, her hand resting on his arm. "You did it," she whispered, her voice full of awe and fear. "It's over." Jesse looked down at her, his chest still heaving from the adrenaline, but the fear in his eyes had faded. The danger had passed, for now, and though he knew more threats might come, for the first time he felt the strength of their bond, the unspoken promise that together they could face anything. The night had settled again, and with it came a quiet peace. The stars above were the only witnesses to the battle that had just taken place. And as Jesse turned to Lila, their hands brushing the cool night air, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. The sun was sinking low behind the distant hills, painting the sky in shades of fiery orange and deep purple. The wind whispered through the prairie, carrying the scent of sagebrush, as Jesse stood at the edge of the ranch, his hand resting lightly on the saddle horn of his horse. He looked out over the land that had once felt empty and lonely, but now seemed full of promise. Lila walked toward him, her boots kicking up the dust as she approached. The soft creak of the wooden porch behind her was the only sound, but it didn't feel like silence. It felt like the land was holding its breath, waiting for something. When she reached him, she stopped, their eyes meeting for a long, lingering moment. She could see the man who had stood tall through every trial, his face weathered by time and hardship, but softened now by the love they had built together. "I never thought I'd find a place like this," Lila said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was running towards something I didn't deserve." Jesse took her hand, his fingers warm and strong. "You deserve it all, Lila. This is ours. All of it." The distant music from the saloon drifted on the wind, faint but familiar, a reminder of the life they had chosen together. Jesse gently pulled her toward him, their bodies fitting together like two pieces of a puzzle. The kiss they shared was soft, filled with the kind of love that only grew through trials, through time. As they pulled away, Lila rested her forehead against his. "I never want to leave this place. With you, it feels like home." Jesse smiled, his heart full. "Then stay, Lila, forever." And for the first time, she believed it. This was their beginning, not their end.